Let me start with a little background. Until recently, my relationship with my wife was very strained. My wife and I had been married for what felt like an eternity. It wasn't that we stopped loving each other, but after so many years together, the passion that once defined our relationship started to fade. You know how that goes, right? I tried everything I could to reignite that fire. Gifts, evenings spent together, even a spontaneous trip to a resort in the hope that a change of scenery might help shift something. And for a while, it seemed to work, but the effect quickly wore off, and we found ourselves back where we started. Then one day, I noticed my wife spending more and more time scrolling through Facebook, particularly pages related to psychology and relationships. After one of these deep dives into the internet, she approached me with an idea, something she had read that was supposedly a modern solution to our problem. "Maybe we should consider an open relationship," she said one evening, quite calmly. At first, I was stunned. The thought of allowing other people into our relationship, even temporarily, had never crossed my mind. On the surface, it felt like a last-ditch effort, as if we were admitting defeat. But the more she explained, the more it started to make sense, though it still felt unsettling. According to the post she'd been reading, the idea of an open relationship wasn't about replacing your partner or running away from marriage. It was a way to break the routine, to bring back the sense of novelty and excitement. Boredom, as they said, is often the cause of fading romance. So why not add a little adventure to our lives? Why not give ourselves the opportunity to explore something new, even if just for a while? I hesitated. "Are you sure this is what we need?" I asked, trying to gauge how convinced she was. She nodded, and for the first time in a long while, I saw certainty in her eyes. "I think it's worth a try," she replied. "What we're doing now isn't working. Maybe this will help us both rediscover what we've lost." After weighing the pros and cons, I agreed. We set some rules. First, it was just going to be a short experiment. 1 week, and that's it. We both agreed that dragging it out could create problems we didn't want to face. Secondly, no connections with close people, no friends or relatives. We wanted this to stay as far away from our normal lives as possible. And lastly, we couldn't meet the same person more than once. This wasn't supposed to turn into a relationship. We were simply looking for new experiences without crossing the line. As we discussed all the details, I noticed how the tension in her shoulders started to ease. It seemed that just talking about something new, something outside of the usual, was already bringing a spark back to her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she looked genuinely excited about something. And maybe that was what convinced me. The next few days were, to put it mildly, strange. Each of us got the chance to experience it for ourselves. At first, I felt uneasy just thinking about it. Daniil, September 16th, 2024, 16:38. A couple of days after my wife had already slept with 2 men, I finally loosened up. I met her. She was young, barely 20, full of life. There was an ease about her, something wild and free. When we first met, she casually mentioned that she worked as a nurse. I remember thinking it was quite impressive for someone her age, and we spent the first part of the evening talking about her career and life ambitions. But by the end of the evening, with the alcohol relaxing us both, she became more candid. I'll never forget the moment when she leaned in, a mischievous smile on her lips, and confessed that she had only been a nurse and embarrassed, but I wasn't. Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe it was the open relationship experiment, or maybe I was just ready for something different. Either way, her confession didn't stop us. It only made the situation more thrilling. The mood shifted, the atmosphere charged with electricity. There, in the dim corner of the restaurant, our connection took on a physical dimension. We were on the verge of losing control right then and there. She leaned in closer. Her hand brushed mine under the table, her breath warm against my neck. Every moment felt tense, as if we were seconds away from crossing an invisible line. She was bold, confident, and had no hesitation in showing what she wanted. I admit, I wanted it too. But something inside me held back. Perhaps it was a final shred of decency, or the realization that we were still in a public place. I managed to stop the momentum and called a taxi. The ride to the hotel was a blur of stolen kisses and heated touches. We didn't even greet the driver, so lost in our passion. Every now and then, she reached for my belt, her impatience palpable, and I had to hold her back, as if trying to restrain a wild force. When we arrived at the hotel, we moved quickly, like we were on a mission. I paid for the ride swiftly, barely noticing the surprised glances from the staff at the reception as we rushed through the lobby. I didn't care what they might have thought. At that moment, it felt like the world had disappeared, leaving only the two of us. I booked the first available room, not thinking about its quality or the view from the window. The only thing on my mind was what was about to happen. The door had barely closed behind us when she took control again. She didn't hesitate. She knew what she wanted and wasn't about to let me take the lead. I could only follow, lost in the whirlwind of her desire and my own growing excitement. She was nothing like I had expected. Despite her young age, she was experienced, and her confidence threw me off balance. I had never encountered anyone so self-assured, so unafraid to take charge. I gave myself over completely to the experience, letting her set the pace. The intensity of it all was overwhelming, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about anything. I was just in the moment, caught up in the raw, physical connection we were sharing. We didn't stop until the early morning. It felt like an endless cycle of passion, one neither of us wanted to break. When we finally collapsed on the bed, exhausted, the first rays of dawn were already peeking through the curtains. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had just happened. The night had been incredible, unlike anything I had experienced before. Waking up a few hours later, I felt like a different person, like a teenager who had just lost his virginity to an experienced woman. It was exhilarating and strange at the same time. My body ached pleasantly, a reminder of the night's events. She was still asleep beside me, her breathing steady and calm, a stark contrast to the wild energy she had shown just a few hours earlier. As much as I wanted to stay and prolong the moment, reality started to creep back in. I had work, responsibilities that needed to be addressed. Quietly gathering my things, I began to get dressed. Daniil, September 16th, 2024, 16:38. I didn't admit to her that I was married. Even in an open relationship, I didn't want to complicate her life with that information. I didn't want to upset her or confuse her any further, and besides, she would probably want to meet again. But I knew this was just part of the experiment. There was no room for repetition or attachment here. When I stepped out into the cool morning air, returning to the life I had left behind for one night, I couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. Was this what my wife and I needed to fill the gaps in our marriage? Or was it just another illusion, a temporary escape from the real problems we hadn't yet solved? I didn't have the answers then, and honestly, I'm not sure if I have them now. When I came home from work, I was greeted by the aroma of a delicious dinner my wife had prepared. At that moment, I felt a pang of guilt for the previous night, but reminded myself that I hadn't broken any of our agreements. I confessed to my wife about what happened that night, and she reacted calmly. There wasn't even a hint of jealousy. She also admitted that she had spent the night with one of my colleagues. I was surprised and expressed my frustration, as even though he wasn't a friend, he was still a close colleague. My wife justified herself by saying she didn't know how close we were. Against this scandalous backdrop, we decided to end the week of open relationships early. I was slightly annoyed that my wife had slept with a colleague, but I still managed to keep my emotions in check. The most significant issue was that she continued to communicate with him. During lunch at the office, I told him to distance himself from my wife, as our experiment with her was over. In response, he said it was just communication but agreed to keep his distance. Meanwhile, that same girl kept messaging me with constantly made excuses, such as having too much work, and in truth, I no longer had the right to see her. However, it turned out to be useful to me in the future. I couldn't help but reflect on the fact that the experiment we started, which we thought would reignite the spark in our marriage, turned out to be much more complex than we had anticipated. In moments of reflection, I questioned why we even started this. Was it truly just boredom? Or were we seeking an escape, a distraction from the real problems we hadn't addressed? The situation with my colleague remained awkward for a long time, even after he agreed to stay away. Every time I saw him, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. As for my wife, I could see that she too began to doubt what we had done, although neither of us wanted to openly admit it. In the end, we were both looking for something: excitement, validation, perhaps a sense of freedom. But what we found was far more complicated. As for the girl who continued to message me, I finally stopped responding. She had served her purpose at that moment, but I didn't want her to remain a part of my life. It was time to focus on what truly mattered: my wife, our marriage, and finding a way to repair the damage done. A typical workday took an unexpected turn when my colleague left the office early for unknown reasons. At the same time, I had to stay late due to urgent matters and had informed my wife about this. Her response was calm, almost as if she had been expecting it. When I finally returned home, exhausted from the day, I immediately noticed a coat and a pair of familiar shoes by the door. My colleague's coat and shoes. My heart sank as I began to realize what might be waiting for me inside. I searched the entire house but couldn't find either my wife or my colleague, so I had no choice but to check the bathroom. When I opened the door, I was met with the loud sound of water, and the scene before me was a complete betrayal. My wife was in the jacuzzi with my colleague, both absorbed in the moment. Their faces were expressions of delight and surprise, but that happiness lasted only until I walked in. The shock was immediate and profound. I couldn't continue watching and quickly left the bathroom. Outside the bathroom, I heard my wife crying. She ran out, she tried to embrace me, begged for forgiveness, and attempted to explain, but her words were lost in the chaos of the moment. I was overwhelmed with emotions and broken. Her appearance, heated and helpless, only intensified my pain. I decided to leave, my mind filled with confusion. I walked out of the house in shock and headed to my car. As I got into the vehicle, I saw my wife running after me. Still, I had locked the car in haste. Seeing her, exposed and in panic, only deepened my sense of betrayal and hurt. I ignored her pleas and drove away without looking back. I went to my childhood friend's house, seeking refuge and sympathy. My friend listened as I poured out all the details of what had happened, offering comfort and perspective. It was a relief to share my grief with someone who understood, though it didn't lessen the pain. In the following days, I was consumed by a storm of emotions. The open relationship, which had started as a way to revitalize our marriage, led to unforeseen complications and heartache. I couldn't help but question what went wrong. Was the initial excitement worth the pain that followed? Did we misjudge our ability to handle the complexities of an open relationship? For now, I wasn't ready to go back home and spend a few days at my friend's place, drinking in the evenings. Over the next few days, I shared every detail of the situation with my friend, who came up with a brilliant idea. He suggested that I take revenge on my wife by sleeping with the same girl I had been with during our open relationship, and then compare the experience to what my wife had offered. I agreed to the plan and went home, ready to confront my wife. After our conversation, my wife admitted her mistakes, and I pretended to forgive her. Little did she know what was coming next. I soon contacted the girl again and, as before, she was eager to meet. This time, she invited me to her home. We spent hours making love, and after growing so close to her, I decided to share my frustrations. She was taken aback when I told her that I wanted to get revenge on my wife. She agreed to help, and once again, we filmed our encounter. I was initially reserved in front of the camera, but she took control and helped me relax. She was passionate and intense, and we finished with me feeling deeply grateful for her support. Afterward, I sent the video to my wife with no additional comments. When I arrived home, my wife was waiting for me, and she was furious. She threw everything she could find at me in her rage. I managed to calm her down quickly and then told her that this was my revenge and that our relationship was over. I told her to leave the house, and she had no choice but to comply. Looking back, I have to say that I didn't find it was a painful and difficult process, but I felt it was something my wife deserved. The entire experience left me feeling empty and conflicted. Despite everything, I was sure that the resolution of our relationship was necessary, but the journey to that point was far from satisfying. Feel free to ask for any changes or additional details if needed.